Welcome back. Very nice to see everyone again. For those of you who weren't here this morning, I'm Liz Carmichael, just to come in and make the external speakers look good by comparison and then run away again. So this afternoon's keynote is Nigel Shadbolt, Professor Sir Nigel Shadbolt, who has been here at Southampton. Do you know, I forgot to do the calculation. How long is it now? 15 years?
I started work officially on the 1st of January 2000.
2000, all right, so nearly 15 years. So Nigel's been with us for nearly 15 years. He started off as all sorts of things. He is Professor of Artificial Intelligence here, and he started off his studies, his PhD in Artificial Intelligence, Psychology and Philosophy, yes? He's gradually tunnelled a path through many subjects, through the cognitive sciences, to specialisms that he has today. He's well known for launching, for being chair and founder of the Open Data Institute with Tim Berners-Lee, and as well as running the web and having run the Web and Internet Science Research Group here, and being a director of the Web Science Initiative and a founder of the Web Science Trust, global collaboration of research laboratories around the world looking at the web and the impact of it on society. Nigel is famously a government botherer, finding himself, just managing to find himself in the right place at the right time to channel huge amounts of public funding or to argue about huge amounts of public funding with prime ministers and chancellors. It's been fantastic to have him here at the University of Southampton. Someone who's keenly, fiercely intelligent, but able to direct that into public policy and the way that governments set their strategies. So you're in for a real treat this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bless Charming introduction, and of course now we've spent 5 minutes exchanging dongles. Thank you. So great to be here, and this is a talk which will be a lot about framing technology in a policy context, because we know technology changes the world, but it takes people to actually sometimes understand those opportunities in advance of our lawmakers and political masters and mistresses. We've got to get in there sometimes and offer a vision of what is possible. And I think sometimes those very same people at the centre of power, the politicians, the lawmakers, leaders of our great companies and public institutions, as we know, are some way off a full technical understanding or understanding of what is possible with technology. That gap is one that we kind of sit and observe on both sides of the fence and wonder, what can we do about it? It's really essential that we do work hard to, as academics and researchers, understand the larger political context we operate in, the legal context we operate in, and on the other hand, they have to know what technology is coming their way. I'm going to talk today about something, just calling the fifth paradigm, this idea of, actually it's about open innovation. It's a new way of creating knowledge. It's not actually a very new way. If you look back to the principles of the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment in the 18th and 17th, 18th century, so many of these same ideas were in play. Big ideas about knowledge being a public good, a common good that one should seek to promote and not retain within small elites. And I think open innovation is a lot about that. That's why I'm particularly passionate about it. You know all about these trends. The only thing you might not know is that the way to get ahead in science is to try and find a log behavior out there in technology land and give it a name, probably your name, and you'll become famous. Well, probably not as famous as Gordon Moore, but Kreider and Cooper and Nielsen, all describing these exponents of change, which means that almost anything, even a professor of AI would stand up and have told you back in 1978 when I went up to study AI at Edinburgh, we were quite carefully assured that no machine would beat a world chess master within a lifetime, whether their lifetimes or our lifetimes, but of course it happened in the 90s, and it happened because of these exponents of change, which were kind of visible at the time, but nobody really understood quite what brute force search, with a little insight, and very large databases of opening moves and middle moves and so on, what that kind of combination, that perfect storm of data, information, and little insight would produce. And we're kind of living through that again. The reason we're living through that again, and this is kind of the slightly scary part of the talk, which is what's going to happen as we generate more and more of this data. It's going to have huge innovative potential, but in the social machines project that I direct, and a number of people here are involved in, we're kind of trying to get our heads around what a world of massively generated, idiocentric, person-centric data will look like. And what happens when everybody's incidentally collecting not just their data, but your data because you're in the frame at the time they're collecting the data. What does that world look like? And people talk about the Internet of Things, and governments pump tens of millions of pounds of money, hundreds of millions of pounds of money into this, with very little understanding of how that will disrupt social norms, lead to new kind of issues and moral panics everywhere, from privacy to surveillance. So, you know, not only will you be wearing them, but you as an individual will be wandering around being a collector, being a censor. And again, if you go back to the 19th century records in this country, when people ran the census, and the enumerators would come around to take the details of each household, and then describe who lived in what place, what their trades were, basic information about them. It is just an extraordinary fact that when we go back now, we can't get all of that data, quite as much as we like as purely open data, but it's rich beyond comparison. It was just a tiny fraction of what we're going to be seeing coming even into view, because we're generating tons of data. The state has lots of data from us, literally from cradle to grave. Those are some of the data sets, but everything you do in a legal state like the UK, there'll be some more or less awful database cataloguing your driving or your passport or what taxes you pay or what social benefits you're entitled to or the healthcare you've had. And of course people have fantasized for years about the big database in the sky that integrates all of this, and we know that's not reality. The reality is much more interesting in terms of distributed capabilities here. And we're generating lots as prosumers. We now engage with any number of services and generate more and more data. And this, of course, is where a lot of the current discussion is around the moral panic that has to do with the fact that a supermarket can look at your shopping basket and predict when you're going to have your baby, okay? Quite accurately. And this just happens to be wonderfully the Target supermarket chain that were the middle of this particular moral panic bullseye. They've been at the middle of a few, actually, it turns out. But that's a fact, as is the fact we now are aware that people can socially mine, they can data mine your social network preferences, and this Cambridge study reveals that everything from substance abuse to your relational status, to your religious leaning, to your sexual orientation, to your ethnicity is highly predicted out of the likes you like to post. So, and we're kind of living in this space now, but we haven't fully worked through what the full consequences of that will be. But we know it's kind of a scary place to be. And actually an awful lot of my conversations at the moment are counteracting the fear behind these observations from both a public and a political constituencies. And it actually drowns out some of the positive upside we're talking about now in open innovation, because they all think it's all data. All data is equivalently kind of, in a certain sense, suspect. Okay? This isn't suspect. This is a world in which we have to develop new norms, new policy, new conventions, possibly some regulation, possibly even some legislation. But to be presented with this new set of facts and reach for legislation in a matter of days, which is how some governments are behaving, is just kind of completely absurd. Okay, and to get on the cheerful side of the conversation now, unutterably optimistic I'll be now, there's this great quote. It's an open quote, and it's taken from a great scientist, possibly one of the greatest scientists to have lived, Niels Bohr. And not everybody knows he wrote passionately about the power of open. He did. He actually had this great phrase, which is the best weapon of dictatorship is secrecy, but the best weapon of democracy should be the weapon of openness. And in fact, at the time, he was writing letters to heads of state, to the President of the United States, to the Prime Minister, to the Premier and Chairman of the Soviet Union, saying that you should share nuclear weapons technology knowledge. Okay? He foresaw, totally accurately, that the only symmetrical situation was essentially mutually assured destruction. He didn't call it that then, but the Mad Doctrine, that if everybody had the weapons, there would, in some sense, be this impossibly difficult situation of nobody being in a position to kind of have such an asymmetric advantage over the other that they would be feeling they would use them. And at the time he was writing this, not all the information was equivalently shared. Through acts of espionage and the help of intelligence officers who had been turned, a lot of the information did end up getting evenly, and big programs of investment on both sides of the Iron Curtain led to these terrible weapons being developed and the knowledge equivalently held. But there was a different model, which would have been, what if we just imagine that information is made available? Now, that's quite a shocking, extreme example, but it's an interesting one where, again, you can see benefits of openness can actually work in very strongly adversarial conditions as well. And in fact, if you think of everything that's happened subsequently to actually police regimes like this, it's been around treaties of mutual observation where there is some sense that the inspectors are seeing what they expect to see, putting entire institutions to monitor proliferation, for example. And it's an interesting twist on this whole discussion. We know this guy's fairly keen about the power of open, and this is about the open web, but I'm going to talk about it in the context that I've been framing this for a while, which is certain systems that allow us to bring information to bear very rapidly. This is Ushahidi, which is the Kenyan system. It was a bunch of open source enthusiasts who put together a very simple architecture for sharing information about civilian rioting situations and various forms of violence that transpired after a set of elections which were widely thought not to have been fairly held. The thing this did was take simple SMS data collection capability, the fact that lots of people had mobile phones, not maybe fourth or fifth generation, but they had mobile phones, and they could report things. A lot of people could increasingly take photos of things, and they integrated that with a simple geolocation capability to put those reports on a map that could be viewed through the web. And the fact that people's eyeballs were then drawn to the resulting chaos was an extraordinarily powerful, again, stabilizing force. Another interesting example of open in a context of trying to enact them. Rather tragically, we have examples here. Middle East Guard, this is a previous incursion. This is Snowmageddon in Washington. This is the Fukushima disaster. Again, this platform being repurposed essentially for rapid gathering of information at scale that could be shared. And the trick behind this is a bunch of principles around open that I'll enumerate and talk about. It's not just about the nature of the data, it's about a bunch of other things too. And the web that we take for granted has its power because of these fundamental principles of being universal, a set of very straightforward protocols and formats in which the platform can operate. Decentralized, an original commitment to the notion of net neutrality, open standards, open platform, and open data. And that was, of course, it's not always instantiated in that way. We should always remember that the web took off as much because companies used it as intranet technology, as much as exploiting the open web. And again, the web is an interesting dual-use technology. You can use it in an open or a closed fashion, and the balance between the two is often interesting. But what we do see in the open web is that we get a powerful perception of structure and insight. So one of my favorites is this picture, which looks like light pollution from a satellite opting somewhere above Europe. In fact, each one of these luminosities is a pixel representing a geocode, a geolocation of a flicker upload photograph. A photograph taken somewhere, then uploaded. And at scale, you start to see structure. This is, you squint your eyes a little bit, each of these black dots now is a flicker geocode, and that is clearly the River Thames, the bridges across the River Thames. This is work that Kleinberg and Associates did some while ago now. We're getting insight directly from bulk data. Okay. Now the issue is, where's the semantics coming from? It's clearly coming from the intended act of taking a photo, uploading, and the fact that people are taking photos in meaningful places. Okay? But the surface data you get still yields insight. More insight, of course, because people rather helpfully annotate those Flickr photos with a few tags, so you can indicate the top 20 locations, tourist locations in London with no effort whatsoever. Well, a little effort, but very little. Those attempts to get insight from data at scale, when you show them to people, they're very compelling. And one of the challenges is to find those equivalences in other sorts of data that are being collected at scale because of a consequence of those laws I was talking about. Those exponential laws mean that very surprising data at scale will tell you when you're going to have your baby, okay? When you expect to have a baby, or will tell you with a high degree of accuracy whether you may be voting for a particular political party or not. There's other emergencies that are just as interesting. So content at scale, talk about the knowledge commons. This, of course, is Wikipedia. And actually, we're doing some interesting analysis on this just at the moment. Sorry. Just at the moment, where we're looking at just what we can see about contributor behavior in Wikipedia. Wikipedia is often regarded by many as a done research project. Nothing could be farther from the truth. There is so much valuable data still locked up, so many insights still to unpick there. And I'll be talking at a conference, Wikimania, quite shortly, where I'll hopefully be giving some additional insights on just what is happening there, given the analysis that colleagues have been doing here on that area. Yeah, that was just the fact that actually within about, I took 2 screenshots about 15 months apart, and in that time we've gone from 3.4 million English articles to 4.2 million English articles. It turns out, of course, that increasingly now people use automated robotic means to populate a lot of the pages in Wikipedia. Some really quite interesting augmentations of this collective authoring happening there. And there's the Wikidata project, which is seeking to rationalize the data that appears in all those language versions of the articles about various objects in Wikipedia. How do you make sure that the data is in any sense consistent? Because traditionally, somebody writing in Russian and somebody writing in English may well have given you very different answers to the population of Moscow and indeed its provenance and source. You know, can you provide a common underpinning there? Very interesting set of challenges around that. And the other side of an open web is not just content and structure and insight, it's actual active problem solving. So again, an area where we're doing a lot of work is in citizen science, where you recruit people for some unique ability that they as humans have with their cognitive capabilities to help solve a problem, or collectively bring their talents together to solve a problem. And whether it's being able to classify a perceptual object such as a galaxy into a type, or help fold proteins, you get this extraordinary ability to harness human capability into the machine milieu. And of course, we shouldn't ever forget that our friends Page and Brin at Google actually did one of the greatest open data heists of all time. They kind of noticed that if you were smart, you could take all those links that you had carefully authored as a human being on the web and used them to calculate something very interesting, the PageRank, which gave you a great measure of relevance and interestingness of the topic. So we kind of know that, but for a number of years now, a number of us have been looking at a particular strain of open that has a very interesting utility, and it's the idea of open data, the idea that in the first instance, many of us looked at this data from the public sector, from governments and local and national public authorities, and thought, what if that data was made available entirely openly, in the best tradition of the knowledge commons? Free to reuse, open, license, possibly with the only requirement that you attribute where you got it. And if you can do that for any data at all, it's probably the data that you as a taxpayer have paid for by being a citizen of the country, and it was collected in your name. Now, this is not data typically about you, okay? So many of these, in fact, almost all of the early efforts in open government data focused on non-personal open data. The obvious fact that personal data, you're not consenting when it's collected to necessarily make that open, but we'll doubtless come back to that as a discussion. Okay, so that's open data. We can argue about its definition, people do actually. And before we get into kind of counts about, you know, who's got the most number of data sets out there, not that I would ever fall into that kind of hubris myself. Here's a couple of other tables that seem to have the UK at the top. What could they be? Well, one is the Open Data Barometer, and the other is the Open Data Index. And this tries to give a representation of the areas of data that are released, rather than just count. You know, what useful data has been released around transport, or government budgets, or government spending, or election results. And there you get various claims as to who's doing well and who's not. I have to say, you take all of these things with a great pinch of salt, and almost the worst thing you can do to a politician is show them a table like this, where they're number one, because they think the job is done. Okay, that's it, it's done, no more to say, move on. And I want to convince you that the job is far from done. Okay, and actually, interestingly, PhD students and others in this room have been contributing and elsewhere to these very efforts to kind of, what does it mean to meaningfully measure the impact and efficacy of open data. So here's where some of the early examples came from, and each country is different. It's interesting, in the UK, we began a lot of our work around what you might think of as governance, and in fact it was about spending. Okay, and it's easy to forget how quickly in areas like spending people can get agitated. Of course, at one stage it was things like the MP's expenses. We had a scandal a few years ago in this country where, surprise, surprise, it was found that our MPs were kind of claiming expenses on a whole range of things that people thought were probably not legitimate. Second homes, duck houses, I mean, don't ask. But there really was an extraordinary range. And so this great mantra was, sunlight is the best disinfectant. It's a lovely phrase, you know, transparency. Get the information out there. The only way you could restore public trust once lost was, in fact, to show people the information. And so, in fact, in this case, this was personal data, but it was beginning to be published in the UK. And when Gordon Brown asked Tim and I to get involved in this effort in the UK, it was very much around the idea of, well, let's start with areas that can show us being transparent and accountable. In fact, for the previous government, it was very much around public service improvement. So things like mortality rates in hospitals, or the accident black spots on our roads. Things where the data was starting to become available and publishing it might have actual serious benefits. This is a couple of examples. This is called the Contract Finder. A really interesting example here of companies not wanting or resisting putting the contracts they sign with government online. Confidential commerciality, all sorts of voodoo phrases. If you're going to contract with the public body and it's taxpayers' money, why should the contract be secret? Okay? And it's been a long-standing area of contention. Increasingly, the government's moving to a position where if you contract with the government, the contract goes online. Okay? And in fact, what you really would like to know is whether the contracts lent and the money spent from the Treasury kind of correspond. It might seem an interesting circle to join. It turned out to be very, very difficult, not least because data on the companies that contract for these services wasn't open. Okay, so the information about the legal companies, it is now open. In fact, from just last week, Companies House, which is the body in the UK that registers all UK companies, makes all of its data open. It used to actually charge significant sums for finding this information out. And as you then begin to reconcile the names of all these companies with some of the contracts lent or the spending incurred, you're in the world of real data analytics. It's a mess. You know, the 35 ways in which a particular company's name has been spelled or misspelled or abbreviated. Your eyes, what are they? You know, the idea that you could use a consistent, strong identifier across the government estate or anywhere to link information together, completely absent. So what we're doing in a lot of our open data work is uncovering the possibilities of a very simply integrated information space. And before we get kind of too cheerfully cocky about what we can do in our space as opposed to in the government space, it's just as bad in higher education, it's just as bad in the business, you know, the data silos, the lack of reconciliation between this sort of labeling and that. Jim gave some great examples this morning of where things just go wrong because you can't always assume the same entity is the same thing. I mean, it's not as if even having the possession of strong identifiers will always win the argument, but at least it reduces some of the noise. Another great example here, these are all examples where the data has become available over the last 5 to 6 years in a way that has really been very transformative. Health has been a classic area. This is quite a widely celebrated website. Not often that National Health England, the Public Health England, these various bodies set up get many plaudits, but this was them taking sets of open data and publishing them out in league table form. And these are the 4 highest killers, in this case in England, organised by regional authority. And what's surprising about the fact that you're so much more likely to die of a nasty in Manchester than leafy Richmond in London kind of confirms your prejudices, but it's interesting to see just how much and by what. And even if you take socio-economically equivalent areas of the country, 15 cities more or less equivalently wealthy or deprived, there's a clear league table. So what's going on in places that means that heart disease and stroke is that much higher than somewhere else? And the publication of this data does something interesting. It holds authorities to account. When you can see it this way, and in fact, interestingly, Manchester here have used this information as a real tool to help examine the facts of the matter. Not always is the data entirely transparent as to what it's saying, that the method of collection or the way in which it's categorised or presented is not always without issue. But there's nothing like a table like that, or this table, which is, these are mortality rates in all the major hospitals in England. And it was these kinds of data sets that led to the clear revelation that some hospitals were performing much worse than others. Why? Reasonable, explicable reasons or not? Shift patterns, weekend versus weekday admissions, the kind of stuff that we've all heard and understood in the papers, in the news in the last few years, driven by the requirement to answer why these data variations exist. And of course, none of this gets to the backstory, which is, do you believe the data? How good is the data? Should we be collecting different data? One of the other things I would suggest that we need to do is educate people that this isn't just a way of making some additional value out of stuff we're just collecting anyway. But this is all driving us to a view that the properly organised businesses or services or countries of the future will be collecting much more of this stuff continuously and consistently, and that's where the revolution will come, not taking some rather tired data collection methods and trying to find new things to do with them. This is childhood obesity in a a part of London which is so shocking you don't want to think about it. And crime and reported crime and transport. This is an interesting example where very, very early on, the impediments to getting joined up transportation information were very significant indeed. You know, when the trains ran, what the delays were, what the fare rates were. And one of the businesses that we've been incubating at the Open Data Institute is actually now assuming seven-figure contracts from authorities because they provide an API to a whole range of integrated data from the transport sector, which are really interesting use cases. We can go through these. What are the things you draw out from this? Well, I will talk about the technology a bit, but the thing that you draw out is actually it's the data principles that are the key. It's policy principles. Although having said that, it's one thing to have a policy, it's another thing to behave as if you had the policy. So cultures change when behaviours change, but these policies turn out to be really important. And one of the things that I'm very proud of is the fact that these principles originate in a number of meetings and correspondences we had with ministers. And they are now UK government policy. And in fact, there are equivalents in a number of countries now that the default is to presume to publish unless there's a reason not to in a machine-readable way. Doesn't mean it's all done, but we're well on the way. And it turns out that licenses are critical for this. It's not all the technology. So the licensing and the legal regime under which you operate turns out to be crucial. This is a thing called the Open Government License, the UK one, which no such thing existed before this effort. So there was Crown copyright, which basically meant the Queen owned everything. But that's not really the position you want to be in if you're a young startup business or you want to put the data to work. So never underestimate the actual extent to which you need to do this work. Tim and I, for obvious reasons, were very keen to push this line, which was the star rating around the way data is actually expressed in a machine-readable form. And actually, we have worked quite hard on this. We still have relatively little of the UK open data expressed in this form, but when it has happened, it's begun to make a real difference. So this is all about, if I have a web dereferenceable address for an item of data, it becomes hugely more valuable, because if I can persuade another ministry to use that, it's a join point between two potential data sets. Well, linked data principles, yes, we know what they are, but we know what the linked data cloud is. Just to remind ourselves about this, here is a great example of linked data, and it is, in some sense, from well, it's not a surprising source anymore, but when we went in to try and release UK geospatial data as open data, we were told that we would never get any data out of the Ordnance Survey. We have about 50% of their data now published as open data, and more to the point, much of it publishes high quality linked data. So this is the administrative data for the United Kingdom, represented from the authoritative government agency, the Ordnance Survey. So every postcode, ward, electoral boundary, region is now available with a strong identifier, okay, and a definition and full data linkage and rendering in a variety of formats, from RDF to total to JSON. It's interesting that already offers an opportunity to do really important cross-linkage in other government data sets. But it's still not the case that any government department that wishes to talk about a ward or a parish or a region is reaching for these identifiers first of all, even though they exist, even though they are mandated. The effort to get people to understand why you would want to do this, the level of data literacy generally is still very far behind what we even have examples of. The Companies House data that was just recently released, again, a URI for every legal company in the United Kingdom could be an extraordinarily powerful resource if it was redeployed in other governmental contexts. So we have the beginnings of a really interesting national data infrastructure. for schools and postcodes, government posts, ministers, bus stops. We have, they're a weird collection. What we do need to do is to engineer towards much more systematic use of these. And there are really good examples of good practice in the UK. I've just shown you one. This is a really interesting site. This is the Department for Companies and Local Government. And they look after and coordinate the 350 odd local authorities in England and Wales. They're already tying together a whole range of data to do with housing, finance, population, health, well-being, using linked data formats. And I'd recommend people have a look at this resource, because underneath that there are lists of the other data assets that they themselves are using to pull together. But it's still the case that this is something of a rather well-kept secret, and I think that what we're looking to do is to show how there are really well-engineered data sets sitting around ready for repurposing and featuring at the centre of somebody's project or business potentially. And so the big thing we're busying ourselves with at the moment is the construction of what we call the National Information Infrastructure, where we can provide for some of those 12,000 or so data sets a significant proportion which are really well architected according to high quality linked data publishing, URI, strong identifier principles. And it will be from health, hospitals, equipment used in hospitals, education, the actual institutions that exist, transport. These things do not exist in spaces where there is so much volatility you couldn't put useful, persistent labels against most of the objects of transaction and behavior in there. So that's the challenge. And what we've been doing to kind of tie this back, is it, where's Nets? He's gone. Okay. I can talk and you're talking, but presumably it might be interesting to have a few questions around this, so I'll talk for a little bit longer and think about to talk about this. At the Open Data Institute, what we've been doing is looking to essentially build businesses that use these data assets to real effect, to a business, to offer a service, to charge a value. And these are quite well-known examples. These couple I'll show now, there's some newer ones I'll show you as well. This is one where the data is quite a surprising one. It's every prescription made out by a general practitioner in England every month. Not to who, but what the drug was, and the amount. It's an extraordinarily rich data set, and it was analysed by a small big data startup, and they observed the interesting fact. We were looking at the prescription habits of GPs for one class of drugs, statins, which account for a very large amount of the health prescriptions bill in England. What proportion of them were the white label, generic, cheap drugs as opposed to the very expensive proprietary drugs? And this is the variation from region to region. We have it right down to the GP level. Wildly different levels of prescribing habit. There was meant to be about £200 million worth of saving in that class of drug alone in 1 year for NHS England, had the habit been to routinely prescribe the generic. Now, how you use an insight like that to change behaviour, to actually build any kind of design trials to see whether the incentives can be changed or shifted, whether there were legitimate reasons, there's often an argument that the side effects of the generics are worse than the special brands. That had been accounted for in this data set, so that had been factored out. It's just a really interesting, powerful insight, and we still have trouble in working out how we deliver this insight into our Department of Health to effect any change. It so happened that in that particular area of prescription, some of the major expensive proprietary drugs went off patent, so they became more widely available more cheaply. But we know that this was one class of drugs. It happens in all areas of drug prescribing, this balance between generic and non-generic drugs. Here's another great example from Open Corporates. This is a company that collects all the world's companies' house data, if you will. Many companies don't have company registers, and they certainly don't have details on who owns who, what company owns what other company, so-called beneficial ownership. This is just a great interactive site here where you go to their site. This is the Cayman Islands, if you didn't know what this massive landmass of the United States was. And this is Goldman Sachs, and this is their networks of beneficial ownership. That's Liechtenstein and Luxembourg, and there'll be the Maldives somewhere, and there'll be the Channel Islands, and it is just an extraordinary map of how one particular firm has established its beneficial ownership network. Other banks do it differently. Look at the Bank of America, it's essentially a very different set of relationships. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because a company like Open Corporates can sell insights and services based around a whole range of issues to do with corporate transparency, corporate ownership, and so forth. Making this data available has been extremely interesting. Here's a recent example done by a company called Spend Network. This shows the amount of money locked up in contracts that haven't been let yet, although procured, and who the big sinners are. And we do very badly in this country. From the moment a small to medium enterprise tries to let a contract to getting the money in for the work is the best step hard of 9 months. Okay? Lots of the new accession countries do it much more quickly. Okay? And it's kind of interesting to know that. This isn't a function of not what you would have expected, but they reckon billions of pounds worth of actual cash are locked up in this failure to transact. Or this, which is a fascinating analysis of peer-to-peer lending. Now this is really interesting. This is showing you effectively, when you look at this site, it's a whole year's worth of data essentially of the 3 biggest peer-to-peer lenders in the UK. Aggregate data, well that is, it's non-identified personal data, so it's data about lends, but not at an identified level. And you can see here, what this shows you is that whilst it might appear that the southeast is one of the biggest lenders, everybody is borrowing and lending in some sense across the country. When you normalise for population and the rest of it, it's showing in this case, if you like, the failure of the high street banks to lend. What the peer-to-peer lenders are saying is it also shows you what's happening in the market. So rather than regulating us to death, make the requirement be to publish our data openly, which is a really interesting way to take the regulatory burden and say, publish the relevant data. And I think it's one that we're going to see more of. Another interesting example of a tool, this one is an evidence-based policy tool developed, Jean-Frank will be involved with this. There he is, call out. Last year, this tool was put together and essentially showing you, it was a tool to try and get the public to engage with policy decisions again. This big democratic deficit, how do you get people to pay attention to what government's doing? Boris Johnson decided to close some fire stations in London, big outcry. A model was built to show essentially the effect of closing stations on attendance times. So the question was, if you close these stations, what difference does it make? If you close other stations, what difference would it make? And the other interesting thing is with this model, they used a lot of footfall data that was obtained from Telefonica, who had provided this as open, anonymized data. So you can essentially factor in the actual population throughput. A lot of London in the evening is empty of people, the city area. So they wanted to kind of give, in a sense, a more representative policy tool. Great tool, by the way, well worth looking at. A good example of where open data can be used to help affect more general scrutiny of policies. And just in case you were wondering, he turned out to have made almost exactly the right decisions on those to close, which wasn't the story everybody expected, but that's how it turned out. And here's the other interesting thing about open data. Who's made $1 billion out of open data? Well, this company, the Climate Corporation, which essentially takes open data from the US in weather, geological data on the kind of runoffs, water supply, groundwater, the state of the soils, agricultural production rates, a whole range of open data, and actually provides farmers in America, in the Midwest in particular, with customized insurance projects to hedge against future crop losses in case there are certain sorts of climate problem emerge. Hugely popular. Monsanto bought this company for $900 odd million. Now, they weren't going out there and claiming they were the world's great open data company, but the fact that so much of their core business was driven out of core open data assets is an interesting observation. So we kind of put that up as a poster child. And you've got to believe anything McKinsey says. So McKinsey claims this is $1 trillion data opportunity in open data. Turns out that a huge amount of it they identified is in the transparency of what things cost to consumers. Which you think of, so open data. What does open data look like in the supermarket shopping basket? Okay. Which you think, well, we get all that stuff all the time in price comparison sites. Actually, if you had real-time data on what the offers and deals were in the shops around you, you would strip huge amounts of price difference out. That's where some of the big savings were. And if you think it's big, well, it is big in consumer land, it's just as big in healthcare delivery land, where the actual costs of services to individuals, to actual doctors and practitioners in the health system is huge and very variable. And as these things start to get surfaced and published out, massive potential savings in the system. Of course, the bigger interesting question is how far, I mean, notwithstanding whatever Adam Smith might have said about perfect information makes perfect markets, how much of the modern market survives on asymmetry of information between you, the buyer, and the seller? I know something you don't know, I know the price that you're going to quote down the road, and of course you're going to trade on the fact, if fact exists in that place. In a world in which the information is held more equivalently, we have to compete on all sorts of issues like quality. Who prefers that sort of stuff? So it is, I think, a very interesting space in where we can claim that this form of data equivalence is a new kind of powerful transparency for the market to enable markets to work in the ways in which some of the originators of modern capitalist theory were thinking they should work in the first place. Now, there are many challenges in this space, and we will talk about many of them in this week's lectures around quality. There are huge issues about how complete the data is, its accuracy. The fact it's so heterogeneous makes it difficult to compare and contrast. Jim's example with what burglary meant on this side of the wall as opposed to the US, where it came from, how recent it is. And these are really material considerations. In many areas, you can tolerate certain amounts of latency, in others it's a business killer. In fact, fabulously, I remember when we were trying to get the timetable data released from National Rail, we were told couldn't do this. It would be a disaster because the public would be misled. Because what would happen is all these apps would be written which would be using out-of-date timetable data. And you just thought to yourself, what world do they think it is in which people will buy apps where consistently the information about where the train is going to turn up is out of date or wrong? Okay. That's usually what happens with a centrally provided service. That's when they can't get the actual real timetable data correct. So the issue that, in some sense, making it widely available, what we've discovered time and time is that the quality of the data tends to increase. It tends to become much more subject to scrutiny and critical reflection. Good thing. We are going to have a huge problem going forward in this data world of what you might think of as curation, not just interoperability, but how the data we produce does endure and how we might migrate it, ensure for its continued reuse. The biggest challenge almost beyond all of this is what we might think of as basic data literacy. It's the fact that in a world of data, what you want are people who can understand something about the parameters of how the information can be abused and misused, used constructively to support one thesis or another. It's not as if the data carries its interpretation or the politics around it on its sleeve. It is to be contested, always to be contested. And what we must always look for, and it is a deep irony that I spend my time talking now about open data, having spent many years as an AI researcher and knowledge engineer, carefully distinguishing between data, information, and knowledge. These are not the same thing. And yet, the term of art we all bandy around is data, open data, data science. It's all about the context of interpretation, how widely you draw that, and ultimately about how you judge or adduce data to be used in an argument. So when people get very carried away and say the future of scientific publication is just publish the data, this is nonsense. Okay? It's clearly the case that the narrative, the justification around the data is the scientific case that in a certain sense will be contested or argued against or appealed. So, hugely important. And security will keep on bedeviling us because we're going to find as we unlock data, people will start to say you're giving away data that could be important from a national security point of view, could be an issue around letting those who do ill using it. This is the real-time ship position data from the AIS, which was the Automatic Identification Scheme, which is a maritime scheme developed originally by the insurers for large ships who wanted to know how fast, where ships were going to help resolve disputes, particularly in insurance terms, whether in fact the rules of the sea were being followed. That data is great, has all sorts of secondary uses now. Small ships carry it, it's massively and widely used, and it has been found to be in the hands of people who would pirate ships, hijack ships. It's a useful source of intelligence, and so there are decisions about whether this is a universal system or whether these things are switched off in particular areas. In just those areas, actually, where you'd like to know where people are. So it's a real challenge. And the one that keeps back time after time is the issue around privacy. We started this whole thing off around the My Data controversy. It is absolutely a mistake to imagine, in my view, that an open data agenda is inconsistent with a deep and abiding desire for privacy. The fact the information is there doesn't mean it can be used in any way whatsoever. There should be accountability and transparency in the use of this stuff, even if it is available. And I fear that we're in a stage where this simple-minded assumption that we can just collect everything, so we should, is kind of winning the day. Actually, the proper decision is whether it should be collected in the first place. When you go past and activate the speed camera, it's taken a picture of your number plate because you exceeded a threshold. Okay? You became a subject of interest at the point at which your behaviour indicated something. So when you become a subject of interest, or when there is just cause, or whatever the framing is around this idea of why you should be taken notice of, is a deeply material question in modern open societies, and one we should never lose sight of. Okay, so just want to say, the power of open for me resides in a mosaic of open features, from licenses to standards to data, to access, to source, but most crucially around open participation. And we're now beginning to see a really interesting maturation of this idea. Open innovation for an open world is a good slogan, but actually you're beginning, it's not just the first person, this is, be pushing this back in the actually early 90s as well. Cheeseborough at Berkeley has been pushing this model of open innovation, and Henry Cheeseborough. There is a whole interesting tradition now of people looking at seeing whether or not the computational models around collectives that are sharing information assets turn out to perform more effectively than those which put, if you like, ring fences around information dissemination. So we'll point you in that direction. So I think we can argue that there is a fifth paradigm here. We're moving on from a situation in which science was essentially purely experimental and theoretical and driven by computational simulation perhaps data-driven in the Microsoft Jim Gray characterization of the subject, to one in which allowing large-scale participation is the essence to a large amount of creativity that we're going to generate to deal with the challenges that we face. And as a collection or a cohort of individuals, the opportunities for all of you in this room are huge. That the methods and techniques, the framing of this opportunity, never been more important, more central, more required than ever. So that's not a bad place to be. Thank you very much. Questions? Any questions? No questions. Yes.
Yeah, a quick question. So I think one of the things about open government data, apart from the fact there's a lot of it, is it's obvious what it is to an extent. The same goes for third sector and private data, but I'm not really clear on whether, at what point crowdsourced data is open data. It has certain elements of openness, and that certainly if you go and ask people to give it to you and they give it to you for free, it is. And also there's the side of personal data that can just be collected, that we've given to various areas, and that someone can come along and collect from various different social media and where we shopped and put it all together. Where do they intersect with open data?
Yeah, that's a good question. They do. There are various forms of Venn diagram that exist where people say, well, there's open data over here, and clearly bus stops and boring things like that, live in an open data world which is uncontroversial. Some of the open data that's being released is very large indeed. There are terabytes of the stuff, some of the geographic data. Not all big data is open data, because companies like Experian and the rest of it are collecting it and harvesting and getting insight out of it. And there's this whole area of personal information at very large scale. Some of it certainly not open, not particularly large, and certainly not open. Although some classes of personal information are given up to be open in that sense. That how you consent that process, how that's organised, really important. The intersection frames some interesting opportunities. But the fact is that, frankly, talking to people, even this level of distinction is missing. So you have to kind of go back and I think and talk in some detail about what's being consented to. So in the case of citizen science, if you look at particular sorts of licensing, certain experiments run under an assumption that your contribution will be open. It won't just be the property of the researchers gathering it, but an open data exercise like, well, if you so capture the Google word recognition system effort at very large scale. The products being used to digitize the world's books, is that a fully open and fair process? They do vary, you're quite right, not all the attributes will be present. We did start resolutely in this area where there was and still remains a great amount to do. But by virtue of some of these limit cases, you get into areas that look very much more challenging, like the personal information. I mean, for example, the prescription data. Nobody has yet, and it would be very unwise to, because they could be potentially prosecuted, attempted to de-anonymize that prescription data and look for that unique individual who has some weird prescription formulation in a particular demographic or small postcode region that the GP is dispensing from, and say, that's Henry, But it's not to say it's beyond the bounds of feasibility and the data is not encrypted in such a way that that's impossible. But in a certain sense, what you're doing there is assuming what the norms of behaviour should and could be as well. Yeah.
Are schools and universities providing people with the skills to live in that world that you've drawn on the diagram?
No.
And is it a place of the ODI to change?
No, I mean, I think that's a space where we're seeing increasing amounts of requirement, both from the civic, the private and the public organisations, to skill people up for these areas and these issues. even the short 5-day courses we do on an introduction to open data at the ODI are hugely popular. We can't do enough of them. We have to train the trainers to kind of find a way to kind of replicate that out. There isn't enough, and I don't think we're doing enough. This is the beginnings of this. This is a very good response. It isn't just to address those issues, it's more broadly still. And for a lot of detailed specialist data analysts, this seems very routine, mundane stuff. It is. But it is the base case on which a lot of other stuff is built. Yeah.
So, a really good point that you made earlier. If you give everyone an equal platform in terms of the balance of the data they have and the knowledge that they know, do you think that will scare businesses, say banks for instance, that new places are going to exist and sort of come into to emerge? So for instance, based on quality or based on service around it, and how is this something that's a bottom-up movement, or is this something that's going to have to be forced from government to allow this to happen?
I think you're seeing it emerge a variety of ways, top down, bottom up, middle. I do think you're seeing that. I think some businesses have been founded this way, and I don't regard GitHub as a business, but it's got $100 million in investment. It's clearly not just doing nothing. I think it regards itself as a business model as you pay to keep it closed. But it understands precisely how the symmetry of access has built a very vibrant community that's adding value. And I think you're seeing companies increasingly think that is another way of doing business. Now, whether certain incumbents will naturally want to give up. So even if you read Cheeseborough's work, he isn't talking about opening everything up to openly collaborate. It's about choiceful decisions about what you keep private and what you choose to share as your intellectual content. And again, those decisions will be interesting ones. But he's making the point that limited knowledge and information sharing has proven to be very successful. And in areas where it is simply too expensive for one company to do the whole thing, pharmaceutical research is quite an interesting example, where big amounts is shared IP, and indeed some of it absolutely open IP, and others is the stuff where they look to add their value. So I think you'll see a whole spectrum of open collaboration types. At the far left-hand side will be those companies which will simply not regard their value as being defined as the information they have that you don't. Be in provision of other services altogether.
But I think it's clear that the law has to catch up, because I used to be a competition lawyer. So, there's a lot about good of competition, but you shouldn't be sharing sensitive commercial data. So acting for companies, and they're thinking, well, the competition lawyers are telling me this, I've got my data protection officers who are telling me this. How do I bring that all together to know what the bottom line of what I should be doing? And I think it's trying to bring that all together and realising that personal data protection law isn't up to date, as they're realising in Europe, but also competition law and thinking about the reuse of data and how it could innovate. But people, as you say, such as Ordnance Service, Royal Mail, I used to act for, and
used to act for them.
Well, no, in a law firm, but they're monoliths that are very sensitive about their personal data, like the postcode finder, etc. And
Yes.
There's also a question of what is personal data now.
Yes. Yeah. That's a great example. I mean, I think you're exactly right. There is we built a regime of protection of information. I mean, right back to the hard issue, but people know there are things wrong with this, but the extent to which you can move existing interests to see there could be more in the pot potentially than they've currently got, because they're making a good living with their monopoly position in this area, and why wouldn't they defend it? I mean, then the question I think you then ask broader, that's where the political will comes in, or a broader reframing of the law to say actually the larger public good is served through this, or there are explicit harms that arise because of this. And I think that's just going to be such an interesting contested space, not least when we attempt to build an open address file, well, we'll see what happens.
I mean, it's interesting to see that Europe is taking the lead. So Neelie Kroes, who used to head up the competition directorate, is now the
she's absolutely drunk all the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, exactly. So it's squaring that circle.
Yes.
So a question about the Open Data Institute. During your lecture, you're saying that It's one thing to have the data, it's something else really to interpret it. And looking at a lot of the things that you showed on your slides, these data can really be used to drive policy, but also they can be used to drive almost personal decisions, or even clinical decisions. I teach here in Berkeley Health Sciences. Is there a research agenda at the Open Data Institute that looks at what exactly the kind of data people need and how it should be visualized to get them to allow them to drive decisions, particularly accurate decisions?
No, that's a very good point. I think there is an interest, but we're at a scale where we're not able to do everything yet. But I think that is a very material consideration. I think what's happening, particularly in health and clinical outcome, there's a lot of commitments around publishing more and more clinical outcome data at the level of individual surgeon performance. I mean, there's quite an interesting case where the edging of the issue around personal data is the opinion's been drawn that the public interest is best served by knowing actually what your death rates are as a cardiac surgeon. But I mean, more precisely, knowing how you can make informed choices or clinical decisions based around this data is a fascinating one. We've got point examples rather than a systematic framework of approach, and I think that's something to actually develop. I mean, I'll give you one good example of an open data deployment that I didn't occur to me at all, was Traffic Council in Manchester have used heart attack incident data, so paramedics turning up to heart attacks, and a whole range of other clinical outcome data to locate their defibrillators. Just really, just think, what a clever idea, as opposed to let's think to put some here and some there, and they realised that they were literally huge holes in their coverage from what they could see. So no, that would be very, very interesting thing to discuss. Yes. Oh, I've got to stop because I'm sorry.
We can take the notes.
Yes, one more question. Yes.
Well, you named before the retro rare inquiries, and these days actually ODI is helping them revising the licensing of the data because of one key point, that is they are very concerned that people start doing what you described, so writing applications that are not reliable, that make strange predictions on the train arrival times that are not consistent, the single view what they want to give of the data. How do you help organizations be less protective about the data? How do you make them feel more comfortable?
Somebody say, you can't give them all this weather data because they'll start using it to build inappropriate tools that don't predict the weather accurately. I don't think the market will find out the crap tools. I mean, that's one thing you do tend to find. There's a more interesting issue about whether there is a systematic attempt to game the data in some way. So, whose interest would it be to provide an app which somehow sent everybody to the wrong place? That should have to be another. But I mean, in fact, these peer-to-peer taxi metering systems like Halo Uber, they're quite interesting examples because the taxi, this is just a scam to get all the business to a certain class of carriers, So there are bound to be issues where I think the notion of what fair and reasonable access to the data to provide the provision of a service is a material concern. So that provenance becomes quite important there, to know whether you think you've got data at source from a reputable range, and it's as much as you do. Okay.
We have to stop
All
there.
right. Thank you. Thanks.